The end of knowledge is power. Powerful words from Thomas Hobbes, right? And they kind of kick off this section of our source material for this deep dive.
They really do set a tone, don't they?
Yeah. And when you hear that phrase, knowledge is power, what name just immediately jumps into your head?
Oh, for most people, I think it has to be Machiavelli.
Exactly. Machiavelli. But that popular image we have, the sneaky, manipulative Machiavellian figure.
Yeah.
Is that the whole story?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? That Hobbes quote, it signals this huge shift, thinking about knowledge not just for its own sake, but as a tool, something practical.
Something that gets you results.
Precisely. And Machiavelli, even though he didn't use those exact words, he's right at the heart of that change. He really embodies that practical results first way of looking at the world, especially politics.
Right. So for the deep dive, we're really going to try and unpack Niccolo Machiavelli. We're focusing specifically on how he bridges that gap, from classical and medieval political thinking into what we now call the modern age. And we're using this scholarly source on Western political thought as our guide.
And it's a source that digs deep, particularly into his two most famous works, The Prince and The Discourses. Which is good, because they show slightly different sides of him, even if the core ideas are, well, pretty consistent.
Absolutely. So our mission here, for you listening, is to get past that simple caricature. Machiavellian meaning just backstabbing and cynical plotting. We want to understand his actual arguments, his observations, some of which are pretty startling, actually, and maybe even some of the surprising nuances in his thinking.
What did he really say? What was he assuming about people and politics?
And why, based on this text, does it still matter so much today?
It's about getting to the real truth of the matter, as he himself put it, looking at things as they are.
Okay, let's dive in, because the source points to this one really specific moment, a single passage in The Prince. And it claims this is basically the point where classical and medieval political thought just stops, and the modern era begins.
It's a huge claim.
It is. But listen to the quote the source highlights. He writes, "My intention being to write something of use to those who understand. It appears to me more proper to go to the real truth of the matter than to its imagination."
Okay, stop right there. The real truth of the matter than to its imagination. That's the core of it.
Right. He goes on, "For how we live is so far removed from how we ought to live, that he who abandons what is done for what ought to be done will rather learn to bring about his own ruin than his preservation."
Wow. Okay, you can see why the source calls that revolutionary. It's a direct, almost brutal rejection of how political thought had been done for centuries. Before him, Plato, Aristotle, Aquinas, they were all deeply concerned with ideals.
The ought.
Exactly. The ought. What's the ideal city? What makes a ruler just? How should people behave?
And Machiavelli just sweeps that aside and says, forget how things ought to be. Look at how they are.
Precisely. It's this clarion call for realism, for empiricism. He's saying, look, if you want to understand politics, and more importantly, if you want to actually succeed in politics, you can't base everything on ideals or fantasies about perfect societies.
You have to look at the facts on the ground.
You have to observe how people really behave, how power really works, in all its messy, often uncomfortable reality. And he's warning rulers. If you cling to those old ideals, if you choose the ought over the s, you're not just going to fail. You're going to destroy yourself.
That focus on reality, on practical outcomes, analyzed without sort of ethical filters, that's what the source calls real politics, right? And it's pure Machiavelli.
Fundamentally Machiavelli.
It makes you think, doesn't it? Beyond politics, like in our own lives, how often do we base decisions or judgments on how we wish things were instead of facing the sometimes difficult reality of how they actually are?
That gap between the ideal and the real. It's a constant human struggle. And Machiavelli is maybe the first big political thinker to argue so forcefully that, at least in politics, ignoring the is for the ought isn't just naive, it's dangerous, it's ruinous.
But this shift in thinking didn't just pop out of nowhere. The source is careful to place Machiavelli right in the middle of the Renaissance, right? Late 14th, 17th century, roughly.
That context is crucial. The Renaissance wasn't just art and sculpture. The source talks about these deeper intellectual changes, how people saw themselves, their world. It was transforming.
Like the humanists.
Exactly. These secular scholars, they were digging back into classical Greece and Rome, but with a new focus. Not just for religious lessons, but to glorify human achievements, human potential. Focusing on this world, on man's works, sometimes over a purely divine focus.
Looking back, but seeing something different, seeing human capability.
Right. And that humanist spirit, that emphasis on human agency, on worldly knowledge, on observing things. The source sees that reflected in Machiavelli's own approach. He looked back to Rome, too, especially its history, its military. But his core method was this rigorous empiricism, this realism, which, ironically, made him break from the classical tradition in other really key ways.
And it wasn't just ideas changing. The source says the actual social fabric of the medieval world was, well, falling apart.
That's a huge piece of the puzzle, that old medieval society. Very static, hierarchical. Your place was mostly fixed by birth. That was breaking down. A new, much more dynamic social order was starting to emerge.
Driven by things like early capitalism.
Yeah, the source highlights that. A money economy taking over from feudal obligations, new markets opening up, trade, finance becoming much more central.
And that kind of economy creates a new kind of person, right?
Absolutely, the entrepreneur, the self-made man, someone who could rise through skill, ambition, maybe a bit of ruthlessness. Not just inheritance. Suddenly, there's this possibility of upward mobility, economically and socially. And the source connects this directly to politics, to the political entrepreneur.
Someone seizing power through skill, not just birthright.
Exactly. And you saw a lot of that in the competitive, fragmented city-states of Italy where Machiavelli lived. It was a time of opportunity for the ambitious, but also immense instability.
And alongside all this, the church's political power was waning.
Definitely. It had been challenged before, but during the Renaissance, this accelerated, eventually leading to the Reformation, of course. The church had been this kind of unifying moral and sometimes political force in the fragmented feudal world, but that role was diminishing.
And feudalism itself was crumbling.
Leaving this patchwork quilt of towns, little principalities, baronies, often with unclear borders, overlapping loyalties, it was really a recipe for chaos. Deeply insecure times.
So this crumbling old order, the new ideas, the economic shifts, it all sets the stage for something new politically.
Yes. Out of all that chaos, the idea of the nation-state starts to coalesce. The source defines it pretty clearly. A defined territory, people owing allegiance mainly to one central government, and that government having the power to actually enforce laws across that territory.
And the source stresses this is modern, like the US, France, UK. They're examples. But places like Germany or Italy, where Machiavelli was from, they didn't unify into nation-states until much, much later.
Right. In Western Europe, this process was really taking hold by the late 16th century, often driven by these absolute monarchs who were crushing the power of the old feudal lords and sometimes the church. And the source makes a point of saying this was often a bloody and violent consolidation of power. That violence is key background for Machiavelli.
Which brings us back to Machiavelli himself. The source calls him a transitional figure.
He's standing right on that fault line, isn't he? Between the medieval and the modern. The source contrasts him with Aristotle. Aristotle sort of summed up the world of the Greek city-state, the polis, which was already fading. Machiavelli. He was looking forward, trying to figure out the political moves needed for this new kind of state that was struggling to be born out of the chaos he saw everywhere.
So he could see the future coming, but maybe the picture wasn't totally clear yet.
That's a good way to put it. The source says he definitely sensed this new order, but yeah, his understanding was imperfect. He talked about the state in ways that sound modern to us, but maybe didn't grasp the sheer organizational complexity the modern state would need.
Like needing a strong ruler, an absolute monarch maybe, to unify Italy?
He saw that need clearly, especially for Italy's situation, but maybe didn't fully appreciate all the other factors involved in building and sustaining a modern state. He had this incredibly powerful national vision. Uniting Italy was his passion, and he's seen as maybe the first real voice for that kind of national ideal. But he wasn't quite a modern nationalist in the way we think of it later.
Still, compared to others at the time, he saw further.
Much further, according to the source. He just had this sharper sense that the old ways were completely broken and something entirely new was needed. New ways of thinking, new ways of acting in politics.
And the source really hammers home that it was the ugly side of the Renaissance, the chaos, the violence, the instability in Italy that really grabbed Machiavelli's attention and shaped his thinking.
Yeah, living through that, seeing it firsthand, it forced his hand. Intellectually, how we live was just so incredibly far from how we ought to live in his Italy. That reality, the source argues, compelled him to look at politics without illusions, to discard those moribund ideals of the medieval world, because, frankly, they just weren't working. They weren't providing order.
It's powerful, isn't it? How crisis can just strip away your assumptions and force you to look at things with brutal honesty.
It really can. Sometimes you need that breakdown to get to that kind of stark realism.
Let's talk a bit about his life, because it's clearly relevant. Born 1469, Florence. A key city-state, powerful but unstable. And he wasn't just an observer, he was in the thick of it, right? A high-ranking official.
Yeah, in the Republican government. That brief period after the French invaded and kicked out the Medici family, who often ruled like tyrants. So he had real practical experience.
But it didn't last long for him.
No, unfortunately. 1512, the political winds shifted again. Forces linked to the Pope drove the French out, and the Medicis came back. End of the Republic. And for Machiavelli, end of his career. He was thrown out, accused of plotting against the Medicis, even tortured.
Tortured, really?
Yeah, the source mentions the rack specifically. Pretty brutal. After that, he was exiled from Florence, forced to live out most of the rest of his life away from the political action he loved.
And it's during this exile, this forced inactivity, that he writes his most famous stuff.
Exactly. The Prince, written in that first year of exile, 1513. His other big political work, The Discourses, came over the next few years. He also wrote on war, history, even plays.
And the source says pretty much everything he wrote, even the plays, had a political edge.
Because for him, politics was everywhere. It permeated everything. The source calls him the most political of men and the most political of times. He really wanted to be doing politics, but fate, or fortuna as he might say, pushed him into writing about it instead.
So the source kicks off its analysis with The Prince. Why start there?
Well, the source sees it as the first unmistakably modern work of political philosophy in the West. It's sharp, direct, and it lays out his core ideas about power so boldly, makes his break from the past really clear.
But the discourse is important too. The source calls it a corrective balance.
Yes, and that's crucial for a rounded view. The Prince focuses on what a single ruler needs to do in chaotic times. The Discourses argues for his preferred system, a republic. And the source stresses the basic assumptions about human nature, about how politics works. They're the same in both books.
So different prescriptions for different situations, but the same underlying diagnosis.
Exactly. The Prince is the manual for a sick patient, corrupt, unstable Italy. The Discourses describes how a healthy political body, a republic, could function under better conditions.
And The Prince is dedicated to Lorenzo de' Medici, the guy whose family returning to power got Machiavelli fired and tortured. That seems...
It does, until you remember his realism. He saw the state Italy was in. He probably thought, realistically, maybe only someone ruthless and powerful like Lorenzo could actually impose order and achieve the unification he desperately wanted for Italy. So, the Prince becomes his job application almost, his offer. Here, he's saying, let me teach you the rules of power politics you'll need to succeed to unite Italy.
Okay, so let's get to those rules. The core of his thinking, especially in The Prince, is power. The source says this focus on power is really what marks him as the first modern thinker tied up with the rise of the secular nation-state.
This is probably the biggest shift. It's not that earlier thinkers didn't know about power. Of course they did. But they didn't see it as the absolute center, the defining thing about politics. Aristotle talked about politics being about community, friendship, pursuing the good life, virtue. For Machiavelli and a lot of thinkers after him, power isn't just part of politics, it's the essence.
So what do you mean by power exactly? How does the source define it?
It's defined as the ability to control other people by compelling them to obey, making them do what you want, whether they want to or not.
Compelling obedience.
Right. The most obvious way is force, violence. But the threat of violence is also power. And Machiavelli thought that could be even more effective sometimes because the person chooses to obey to avoid the pain.
And you mentioned even seemingly nice things like giving gifts.
Yeah, if giving favors or rewards creates dependency, then the threat of taking them away becomes a way to compel obedience too. So, at its core, Machiavelli's concept of power, as the source presents it, is about coercion. It's always something very close to violence, even when it looks like something else.
And if you're focused on compelling obedience through coercion, that implies a certain view of what makes people tick, right? A specific view of human nature.
Absolutely. The source says Machiavelli's view is that humans are essentially self-interested and self-regarding. We're primarily driven by what benefits us.
And that's why power works.
That's exactly why. Violence works because it plays on our most basic self-interest, avoiding pain and death. Rewards work because they play on our desire for gain, money, status, security, whatever.
So if people weren't primarily self-interested, if they could consistently put the common good first,
then power, as Machiavelli understands it, just wouldn't work. Threats wouldn't compel, rewards wouldn't bribe effectively. Politics as we know it, based on managing these self-interests, might just disappear. Maybe Plato's ideal republic could exist then. But Machiavelli, looking around him, observing history, he was utterly convinced that's just not how humans operate. Self-interest is king.
Okay, that sounds pretty dark. Self-interested, driven by fear and desire. St. Augustine would have called that sinful, right? Part of humanity's fallen nature. How is Machiavelli different?
And this, the source argues, is where he's truly modern, truly revolutionary. Machiavelli doesn't see this self-interested behavior or the need to use power to manage it as sinful. He's approaching it like a scientist, an empiricist. His psychology comes purely from observation.
From how people actually behave, not how they ought to behave.
Exactly. Not from some religious or moral blueprint. So when he says people are bad, he doesn't mean they're inherently evil in a theological sense. He means they are observably self-interested, they pursue their own advantage, and therefore they are subject to being controlled by power by manipulating their fears and desires. It's an empirical description, not a moral judgment from him. Acting out of self-interest isn't a sin in his framework, it's just human nature, an observable fact, like the earth going around the sun.
So given that view of human nature, focusing on the mechanics of power makes perfect sense. What's his method then? How does he approach studying power in The Prince?
He basically sets out to describe and explain the logic of power. He sees it as something rational, something you can analyze. If people are driven by self-interest, then a leader who understands what people want or fear in a specific situation can logically figure out the actions needed to control them.
Like a kind of political physics.
Almost, yeah. And this idea that power has a logic, that it can be analyzed systematically, was hugely influential. The source points out that later thinkers like Thomas Hobbes really ran with this, trying to build a full-blown science of power. Machiavelli really laid the groundwork.
So The Prince is essentially a technical manual based on this logic of power. Who's it written for?
That's exactly how the source frames it, a how-to guide for getting and keeping power. And it's aimed squarely at the new ruler, the political entrepreneur we talked about, the guy who clawed his way to the top through skill or force or luck, not because he inherited the throne or had some long-established legitimacy.
Why him specifically?
Because that ruler doesn't have the safety net of tradition. They can't rely on people obeying just because their family has always ruled. They have to rely on the effective, calculated use of power to survive. They need to learn this logic of power fast.
Okay, let's get into the nitty-gritty. Some of these rules from The Prince that the source highlights. What are the absolute bedrock principles, the two most important rules?
The source boils it down to two fundamentals. First, think empirically. Analyze politics based only on observation, on the cold, hard facts, and draw ruthlessly logical conclusions from those facts.
And
Crucially, this means you have to ditch all your preconceived ethical ideals. Why? Because Machiavelli believes those ideals about justice, fairness, goodness will just blind you to the reality of how power actually works. They get in the way of clear sight.
Okay, so think realistically, logically, without moral blinkers. What's rule number 2?
Rule 2 flows directly from Rule 1. You have to act as logically as you think, even if the logical action violates conventional morality.
This is where it gets really controversial.
This is it. The source brings back that key quote again. How we live is so far removed from how we ought to live that he who abandons what is done for what ought to be done will bring about his own ruin. And then Machiavelli adds that killer line. A man who wishes to make a profession of goodness in everything must necessarily come to grief among so many who are not good.
So it's not enough just to see the harsh reality. You have to be willing to act harshly if reality demands it.
Exactly. If your goal is to hold on to power and keep the state secure, you simply cannot afford to always act like a saint. You can't run a state like you're conducting a Sunday school, as the source puts it. The logic of power demands logical action, even if that action involves things traditionally seen as deceitful, cruel, or unjust.
Right. So starting from those two core rules, think empirically, act logically, even if immorally. What practical advice follows for actually keeping power?
The most basic practical rule is keep power concentrated in your own hands. Never let anyone else, especially rivals or ambitious nobles, become powerful enough to challenge you. Because given that everyone is self-interested, any power you give away is power that can, and likely will, be turned against you eventually.
But hang on, a ruler can't do everything themselves. You need soldiers, advisors, tax collectors.
Right, that's the dilemma. You have to rely on others. So the constant challenge is, how do you use others without letting them become threats? How do you maintain maximum control over the very people you depend on?
And the answer is,
Keep them dependent on you. Never let the situation reverse. And this leads to that really famous, chilling piece of advice. A prince must be prepared to either caress or annihilate men.
caress or annihilate. Wow.
Yeah, it's stark. Annihilate means use power in its most final form, eliminate your opposition completely so they can't hurt you. Caress means use the softer forms of power, manipulate people with rewards, favors, promotions, making them loyal because they depend on you for benefits. Both are about control, just different methods.
And this kind of advice is exactly why Machiavelli got such a fearsome reputation, isn't it?
Yeah.
People heard annihilate men and thought he was just advocating pure brutality.
Yeah, absolutely. It fueled centuries of criticism, the church banning his books, people calling him frightful Machiavelli. The source even mentions Frederick the Great attacking him in the 18th century, calling him a criminal, monster, enemy of humanity. It's where the term Machiavellianism, as shorthand for cynical, ruthless evil, comes from.
But the source argues this is largely a misunderstanding, that he wasn't just promoting random cruelty.
That's a really important point in the source's analysis. It argues he's not praising power for its own sake, and definitely not advocating unlimited or arbitrary violence. He actually thought that would backfire, make the prince hated and unstable. His advice, however harsh it sounds, is rooted in a calculation of efficiency and logic aimed at preserving the state. It's not about enjoying cruelty. We'll get into why the source thinks this misunderstanding happened later.
Okay, so let's look at the logic of violence then, as the source presents it. It's a tool, right? Not good or bad, just effective or ineffective.
That's the frame. The primary question isn't, is this violent act ethical? It's, is it necessary? And how can it be used most effectively to achieve the political goal? Worrying about the ethics, the source suggests Machiavelli thought just leads to moral squeamishness, which makes you hesitate and potentially use violence ineffectively when it is required.
So what are the rules for using violence effectively, according to this interpretation?
Rule 1. Only use it if it's absolutely necessary. Pointless violence just creates enemies. Rule 2. If you have to use it, do it quickly and mercilessly all at once.
Why quick and merciless?
His logic is brutally simple. People will revenge themselves for small injuries, but cannot do so for great ones. So if you injure someone, make sure the injury is so total, so devastating that we need not fear his vengeance.
Eliminate the capacity for revenge, basically.
Exactly, because violence breeds hatred, and hatred makes people unpredictable. They might seek revenge, even if it's suicidal. So either kill them outright or completely crush their ability to ever act against you again. Half measures are dangerous.
What about the other side, the caressing, using non-violent methods like favors?
The timing is the opposite, but the principle appealing to self-interest to create dependency is identical. Violence. Quick, decisive. Injury should be done all together so that being less tasted, they will give less offense. Get the pain over with. But benefits, rewards, favors, doled out little by little so that they may be better enjoyed.
Why little by little?
To prolong the feeling of gratitude and dependency, keep them coming back for more, keep them feeling positively towards you over a longer period.
And wasn't there another rule about violence? Something about getting someone else involved.
Ah, yes. The third rule for handling necessary evils. If possible, get someone else to do the dirty work. Why? Because the hatred and resentment generated will stick to the person who actually carried out the act, not necessarily to the prince who ordered it behind the scenes. The source uses that famous Cesar Borgia story to illustrate this perfectly.
All right, tell us that story again, the way the source presents it. It's quite something.
Okay, so Cesar Borgia had taken over this region, the Romagna, which was apparently lawless and chaotic. He needed to pacify it quickly, so he appoints this notoriously cruel and efficient lieutenant, Ramiro de Orco, and gives him basically unlimited power to restore order. Ramiro goes in, uses brutal methods. It's very successful. The province becomes peaceful. But in the process, Ramiro becomes widely hated for his cruelty.
So Borgia used him to do the necessary dirty work.
Exactly. But then Borgia decides Ramiro's cruelty and the power he wields have become a liability. People hate him. So Borgia needs to regain the people's goodwill and show that the harshness wasn't really his fault. What does he do? One morning, in the main square of Cesena, the people wake up to find Ramiro de Orco's body, cut in two pieces.
Cut in half. Publicly displayed.
Yes, displayed with a piece of wood and blood-stained knife by his side. And the source notes Machiavelli's observation that this ferocity of the spectacle caused the people both satisfaction and amazement.
Satisfaction. Because the hated enforcer got his comeuppance.
Precisely. The people's hatred was purged by seeing the cruel agent punished so brutally. And Borgia, by ordering this execution, distanced himself from the cruelty. He appeared as the ultimate dispenser of justice, punishing Ramiro's supposedly excessive actions. The source uses this to show what using violence wisely means for Machiavelli, being utterly cold-blooded, calculating, and unscrupulous, using it logically without the hindrance of moral feelings. Borgia is praised not for being violent per se, but for using violence coolly and logically to achieve his political aims. It's controlled, strategic cruelty, the opposite of random or unlimited violence.
Okay. What about another classic Machiavelli dilemma? Is it better to be feared or loved?
His answer comes down to pure pragmatism and control, according to the source. Better to be feared. Why? Because, as Machiavelli observed, men love at their own free will, but fear at the will of the prince. Love is fickle, it depends on the other person. Fear. That's something the prince can instill and control. So a wise prince must rely on what's in his own power, fear not on something unpredictable like love.
It always comes back to control.
Always. Same with the famous fox and the lion metaphor.
Right, so prince needs to be both.
Yeah. It's another logical deduction about what's needed for survival. The lion cannot protect himself from traps, and the fox cannot defend himself from wolves. You need the lion's strength and ferocity to scare off enemies and fight battles. But you also need the fox's cunning, its slyness, to recognize deception, avoid traps, and navigate tricky political situations. It's about having the right tool or the right animalistic quality for the job, all deduced logically to maximize power.
Now, one piece of advice seems a bit surprising given all this talk of ruthless control. His recommendation that a prince should base his support on the people rather than nobility. Why the masses?
The source explains this isn't about democratic sentiment, it's more of that cool logic of power politics. Machiavelli observes that the aim of the people is more honest than that of the nobility, the latter desiring to oppress, and the former merely to avoid oppression.
What does that mean in practical terms for a ruler?
It means the common people generally just want stability. They want to be left alone to live their lives without being pushed around too much. They don't usually have ambitions to seize power themselves, and they lack the means to do so effectively. The nobility, on the other hand, they're interested in power, they're ambitious, they have resources, they're potential rivals. So, empirically, Machiavelli concluded, the people pose less of a threat. They are easier to satisfy, and therefore a more reliable base of support than the constantly scheming elite.
That's fascinating. It flips the usual aristocratic fear of the mob completely on its head, using purely power-based reasoning.
Exactly. And this insight, this understanding of the people as a potentially stabilizing force, is a really important bridge to his other major work.
The Discourses, where he actually argues for a republic. The source says that when writing this, studying history, he made a momentous discovery about the people. What was it?
He realized, based on his study of history, especially the Roman Republic, that a state built on broad popular support is actually more stable and lasts longer than one ruled by a prince or a small aristocracy.
But wasn't the common wisdom the opposite? That the masses are fickle, unreliable? He who builds on the people builds on mud, as the saying went.
That was the standard view going way back to Plato. The masses were seen as politically ignorant, easily swayed, fundamentally unstable. But Machiavelli's empirical reading of history suggested otherwise. He argued that the supposed political naivete of the people wasn't destabilizing, it was the opposite.
How so?
It was the sophisticated, politically savvy nobles who were the real source of trouble. They were the ones constantly suspecting hidden motives, plotting, resisting authority, trying to grab more power for themselves. The common people, lacking that intense love of power and political ambition, were actually less prone to causing major political disorder.
So again, it's not that the people are inherently morally superior.
No, the source is very clear on this. Machiavelli did not think the people were naturally good. Their relative stability came from their social position and lack of opportunity or burning desire for high office. He fully believed that anyone, commoner or noble, would act viciously, meaning self-interestedly, if they had the chance and it benefited them. A smart leader always has to remember that potential.
But under normal circumstances, their main desire isn't power, it's liberty. Freedom from being oppressed.
Right. Their political simplicity and their focus on just wanting to live freely made them, counterintuitively, the ideal foundation for a stable state, in his view.
And this discovery is why he champions republicanism in the Discourses.
Yes, that's the argument from the source. It leads him to advocate for a republican government, modeled somewhat on the Florence he served. The source suggests the Discourses offers the first glimpse of the idea of a modern democratic nation-state that finds its stability precisely in generating mass support and loyalty.
So just to be clear, the Prince is the emergency manual for chaos. The Discourse is the blueprint for his preferred, more stable system.
That's the distinction the source makes. The Discourses provides the corrective, showing his ideal. But, and this is critical, the source insists the fundamental assumptions about human nature, power, realism. They are identical in both works, are just applied to different contexts. Prince for corruption and instability, Discourses for when a virtuous republic is actually possible.
What does this ideal republic look like in the Discourses? Is it like a modern democracy as we know it?
The source uses words like liberal and democratic, but immediately qualifies them. Democratic didn't mean everyone gets the vote. The franchise would have been much more limited than today. And liberal wasn't about abstract rights like free speech. Machiavelli actually expected fairly tight censorship of manners and morals to keep society healthy. For him, liberty in a republic meant primarily citizens being free from arbitrary government oppression in their daily lives and having a say in choosing leaders without being forced.
Still, pretty forward-thinking for the early 1500s.
Oh, definitely. And one idea in the Discourses that the source highlights as particularly advanced is his argument about conflict.
That conflict within society can actually be good.
Yeah, that conflict between different groups, even groups with different ideals, if managed properly, could actually strengthen the state, not just weaken it. This went against pretty much all conventional wisdom at the time, which saw internal conflict or factionalism as purely destructive.
How could conflict strengthen a state?
Machiavelli argued that this managed political conflict, provided it didn't spill over into violence, kept things dynamic, brought issues out, and could even help train citizens in civic virtue in thinking about the public good through debate and compromise. The source notes this anticipates modern ideas about pluralism in liberal democracies, the idea that competition between interest groups is actually healthy for freedom.
So how does this ideal republic stay healthy? How does it avoid decaying back into the kind of corruption that needs a prince?
According to the source, it all depends on the people remaining uncorrupted. They need to be constantly educated and encouraged in civic virtue, this love of country, this willingness to sometimes put the public good ahead of pure self-interest. Because if that civic virtue fades, if politics just becomes a scramble for personal gain, then Machiavelli believed the only way to maintain order is through the harsh power politics described in The Prince.
And the social structure has to support this.
Absolutely. The source emphasizes Machiavelli believed a healthy republic needs a foundation of extensive equality. Not just political equality in theory, but significant social equality too. He saw huge gaps between rich and poor as a major source of resentment, factionalism, and instability.
And it's not just about laws and equality, right? He knew you needed strong social institutions too.
Yes, like the classical thinkers, he understood that a legal constitution on paper isn't enough. You need a supportive social constitution, a whole network of institutions, customs, and beliefs that reinforce the laws and encourage civic virtue. And the most important of all these institutions, for Machiavelli, religion.
Okay, here we go again. This seems so counter to his secular reputation. Why is religion, for this irreligious guy, so vital?
Because, the source insists, his interest is purely political. As a realist, he just observed the immense political power of religion. He saw that religion gives laws and the social order a kind of divine sanction. Without that belief in something higher backing the rules, why would people obey them consistently, especially when it wasn't in their immediate self-interest or when the police weren't looking?
So the fear of God is politically useful.
Hugely useful. The source quotes him directly on this. The observance of divine institutions is the cause of the greatness of republics. The disregard of them produces their ruin. For where the fear of God is wanting, there the country will come to ruin unless it be sustained by the fear of the prince. That last part is key.
Fear of the prince can substitute for fear of God, but only temporarily.
Exactly. But as the lives of princes are short, the kingdom will of necessity perish as the prince fails in virtue. So, for Machiavelli, fear of God is a more stable, long-lasting foundation for obedience, what the source calls a mechanism of authority compared to fear of the prince, which is just raw power and dies with the ruler. It's why the source suggests he'd agree with Voltaire. If God did not exist, it would be necessary to invent him. It works, politically speaking, especially with the general populace.
So his only concern was religion's practical effect on state stability.
Pretty much. And therefore, logically, the state needed to control religion control the church, control its teachings, make sure they supported political order, and encourage the right kinds of virtues.
Did he criticize the Christianity of his day then?
Yes, but again, for political reasons. He slammed the papacy for interfering in Italian politics and preventing unification. But he also criticized Christian teachings themselves from his political perspective.
What was wrong with Christian teachings politically?
He thought they focused too much on otherworldly things: meekness, humility, suffering, preparing for the afterlife. He felt these virtues made people feeble, unwilling to fight for themselves or the state. The source quotes him saying, Christianity makes people an easy prey to evil-minded men because believers are more disposed to endure injuries than to avenge them for the sake of getting into heaven.
So a religion teaching people to turn the other cheek is bad for state security in a dangerous world.
From his purely political viewpoint, yes. He actually preferred the pagan religion of ancient Rome, politically speaking. Why? Because paganism, as he saw it, celebrated worldly glory. It deified only men who had achieved great glory, such as commanders of armies and chiefs of republics. Christianity, he felt, glorified the humble and contemplative men than the men of action.
He wanted a religion that glorified the state and its defenders.
Exactly. A religion of man, a theology of action. In pagan Rome, religion served the state. Christianity, he thought, put the sacred above the secular, potentially weakening the state. Now, realistically, he knew Christianity wasn't going away. So his practical advice was to reform it, reinterpret it, to emphasize love of country and justify the tough actions needed for the state's survival.
This distinction you made, fear of God versus fear of the prince, leads to this key concept the source introduces: authority. How is that different from power?
Okay, this is crucial. Power, remember, is compelling obedience through force or self-interest. Authority is different. Authority is when people obey because they believe it's the right thing to do. They see the law or the ruler or the system as legitimate, as morally appropriate. They obey because they consent internally, not just because they're scared.
And the source says most stable systems rely on authority, not just power.
Yes. Regimes based purely on power, constantly forcing people, tend to be unstable. They have to rely on those Machiavellian power rules. Authority provides a much stronger, more enduring foundation.
So does Machiavelli, the guy who wrote the rulebook on power, actually prefer authority?
Yes, he does. But, predictably, for a pragmatic reason, relying purely on coercive power is incredibly inefficient.
Inefficient. Raw power seems pretty efficient at getting things done.
Think about the costs. The source explains. Maintaining control purely by force requires huge resources. Armies, police, spies, everywhere. It's incredibly expensive. And even then, it often doesn't work perfectly. You can't watch everyone all the time.
And using too much force can backfire.
Definitely. Machiavelli knew that. Excessive force breeds hatred, resentment, resistance. And the very people you rely on to wield that force, the military, the police chiefs, they become potential threats themselves. Regimes based only on power are notoriously prone to coups and internal conflict.
Plus, power is tied to the ruler's lifespan and effectiveness.
Right. Power lasts only as long as the prince is strong and alive. Authority. It can outlast any individual ruler because it resides in the people's belief, their moral acceptance of the system. They obey the law, not just the man.
So the main job of a good leader, especially in a republic, is actually to build that authority.
That's what the source argues Machiavelli believed. The real measure of success isn't just ruling effectively yourself, but setting up laws and institutions that create lasting authority. He wrote, "The welfare of a republic or a kingdom does not consist in having a prince who governs it wisely during his lifetime, but in having one who will give it such laws that it will maintain itself even after his death."
And religion is the #1 tool for building that authority.
It's the primary tool for Machiavelli, according to this reading. Fear of God, authority, is more reliable than fear of the prince, power. And this ties right back to the people. A republic, drawing support from the broad populace, is more stable precisely because the people, with their relative acceptance of religious beliefs and social norms, are the best source for generating and sustaining that authority.
Wow. Okay, so this picture of Machiavelli preferring authority, seeing religion as its basis, advocating a republic built on the people, it really clashes with that standard image of the cynical mastermind pulling strings through fear alone.
It absolutely does. It contradicts that caricature, which the source argues was largely shaped by centuries of anti-Machiavellian propaganda. The source goes so far as to say it's perfectly accurate to say that Machiavelli was a Democrat and a libertarian who believed the state should be bound by authority, based upon rule of law, undergirded by religious institutions, supported by an equality of citizenship, and ruled by those with a conception of the public good.
Whoa. Democrat and libertarian, though qualified by what those terms meant then.
Exactly. Qualified, but still a stark contrast to the usual image.
So, if that more complex picture is right, why did the negative image stick so hard? Why the frightful Machiavelli reputation for centuries?
The source has a really interesting theory on this. It's not that his critics were totally wrong that he was saying something new and, to them, dangerous. They just fundamentally misunderstood what was so radical about it.
It wasn't just that he justified using power ruthlessly.
No, the source argues that wasn't the core issue. As we've seen, he argued for controlled, logical power, not unlimited brutality, and always for the sake of the state. The truly radical thing, the real break, was his rejection of the entire classical and medieval tradition of judging politics by ethical standards. That whole framework, built by Plato, Aristotle, Aquinas, he implicitly tossed it aside.
Ah, okay. So the backlash sensed this deep philosophical break, but attacks the surface symptoms, his advice on power, rather than the root cause.
That's the idea. They felt the ground shifting beneath their feet, the ethical foundations cracking, but they ended up focusing their attacks, mistakenly according to the source, on his specific means, violence, deception, without fully grasping his radically different philosophical starting point or his ultimate end, a stable secular state.
So what is the genuinely revolutionary core, then? The thing that really broke the mold?
The source points to one final, absolutely crucial rule from the prince. It's the idea that the prince must learn how not to be good, B-U-T, and this is the key, while simultaneously appearing to be the exact opposite.
Appearing to be good while being willing to be bad. That sounds like the Machiavelli everyone thinks they know.
It does, but the source argues the emphasis on appearance is the most profoundly revolutionary part. Let me read the key passage the source uses. The prince should seem to be all mercy, faith, integrity, humanity, and religion, and nothing is more necessary than to seem to have this last quality religion. Why? For men in general judge more by the eyes than by the hands. Everybody sees what you appear to be, few feel what you are. And then the kicker, and in the actions of men, and especially of princes, the end justifies the means. If the prince conquers and maintains the state, the means he used will appear honorable because the vulgar is always taken by appearances.
So, learning how not to be good is about mastering the sometimes harsh logic of power. A break from medieval thought that saw injustice only as a regrettable necessity. But the truly radical move is saying that in politics, the appearance of virtue matters more than the reality.
That's the absolute core, according to the source. And
Right.
this, the source argues, completely reverses the whole Platonic order. The prince is like the mirror image, the negative of Plato's Republic. Machiavelli's core claim that appearance trumps reality in politics is the very thing Plato spent his life trying to disprove.
You mean like in the Republic, where they debate whether it's better to be just or just appear to be just? Because appearing just often seems to bring more rewards in the world.
Exactly that challenge. That was rooted in the sophist argument that, practically speaking, might makes right, and justice is just a convenient label. Plato argued against this, insisting justice had a real intrinsic value. Machiavelli, by making appearance the key to political success, is essentially going back to those sophistic political principles.
Like the sophists, he's focused on rhetoric, appearance, and the struggle for power.
Yes. And crucially, the source points out that this ability to gain and keep power, which requires appearing virtuous while being willing to act unjustly, is what Machiavelli, just like the sophists, calls virtue, his concept of virtue. Profoundly ironic, because Plato argued that what the sophists called virtue was actually its opposite. It was vice or evil. Machiavelli reclaims the sophistic term and perspective.
And this isn't just about ethics. It gets down to fundamental questions about knowledge itself, right? Epistemology.
Absolutely. The source makes this connection very strongly. Whether you think Plato or Machiavelli is right depends on your view of knowledge. If you believe, like Plato, that there's an objective moral order out there that we can actually know through reason, then Machiavelli's prince, who ignores or violates that order, is simply evil.
But if you don't believe in that kind of knowable moral truth,
If you're like Machiavelli and you don't accept that objective moral order exists or is politically relevant, then there's nothing ethical to know in the Platonic sense. What you can know is the real empirical world, how people actually behave, what forces are actually at play. This is what Plato famously called the cave world of shadows and illusions.
so Machiavelli's prince is like someone who knows they're in Plato's cave.
That's the powerful analogy the source uses. The Machiavellian prince knows he's in the cave, except there's no getting out to some higher reality of pure ethical forms. And so his knowledge consists of understanding and manipulating the shadows, the appearances, beliefs, fears, desires that actually control people within that cave.
And this rejection of an ethical standard applies not just to Plato, but to Aristotle and Cicero too,
Yeah.
even though they were more empirical sometimes.
Yes, the source argues it applies equally, because even Aristotle and Cicero, with their more worldly focus, still operated within a framework that assumed politics served some larger ethical purpose or telos. Aristotle's empiricism was embedded in a system where things naturally move towards their proper end or good. Machiavelli, the source states, is completely anti-teleological. He sees no inherent purpose, no grand design in politics or human history beyond what you can observe, no forms, no natural law guiding things, no telos, just empirical reality.
So that's what he means by rejecting imagined republics. It's rejecting that whole tradition of judging politics by an ideal ethical standard.
Precisely. It's not just the practical realpolitik of the prince. St. Augustine had realism too. It's Machiavelli's insistence on studying politics entirely separately from any external ethical framework, unless you count the survival and glory of the state itself as an ethic. This radical separation, the source argues, is what makes him the first genuinely modern political thinker.
And this amorality, this separation from ethics, applies just as much to the discourses in its republic as it does to the prince.
Yes, the source is adamant about this. The prince is obviously amoral in its focus on power techniques. But the discourses, despite advocating for a republic and using terms like civic virtue, is equally amoral at its foundation. The underlying assumptions about knowledge, reality, and human nature are identical. Those terms, authority, virtue, liberty, don't have the deep ethical meaning they had for classical thinkers. For Machiavelli, they're ethically neutral concepts valued for their practical contribution to state stability.
So the difference between the two books isn't ethical versus unethical.
No. The source argues the difference lies in the kind of appearances that can be maintained. In a stable republic, discourses, institutions can support the belief in justice, virtue, religion. People operate under these illusions. But for Machiavelli, they remain useful illusions, not ethical realities. He understood that, practically, it doesn't matter if objective justice exists, as long as people believe it does and act accordingly. In the Italy of the prince, those illusions had broken down due to corruption. The old beliefs no longer held sway. So he had to resort to recommending raw power techniques because the mechanisms of authority based on ethical illusions were no longer working.
What's the ultimate impact of all this secularization?
Machiavelli saw the medieval world was over. Modernity needed a new political science, one grounded in reality, not fading ideals. The rise of the purely secular state would lead to purely secular theories. But it went further. The sacred itself, religion, morality, would become just another factor to be analyzed and manipulated by those who understand how things really work. For those insiders, the classical link between politics and ethics was broken forever.
And that break, seeing ideals as illusions, studying facts separate from values, or treating values as facts to be manipulated, that's the real revolution.
That's what the source identifies as the genuinely revolutionary character. Even his warnings against excessive violence aren't based on morality, but on the pragmatic, observable fact that it's usually counterproductive.
The source uses the term ethical naturalism for this. What's that?
It means deriving your values or oughts purely from factual, empirical observations of judging what's good based only on what seems to work or what exists naturally. Modern political science, especially the more quantitative or power-focused branches, often operates this way, inheriting it from Machiavelli. The language changes. Less talk of classical virtue, more talk of empirical facts. And the central term becomes power. Barely mentioned by the classics, absolutely central to modern thought. Other modern terms, sovereignty, rights, consent, they all get discussed largely within the context of power.
Okay, the source doesn't just praise him, though. It levels some criticisms, too. What are they?
Well, first, that epistemological innocence we touched on. He kicked off this whole modern way of talking about politics, but he wasn't really aware of or interested in the huge philosophical assumptions behind his own method. His realism came from practical experience and historical study, not deep philosophical reasoning about knowledge itself. Unlike Plato, who started with metaphysics, Machiavelli just starts and ends with politics.
So he didn't fully grasp the philosophical bomb he was setting off.
The source suggests not. Another critique is about the state itself. He seemed to assume the emerging secular nation-state was its own justification, that it didn't need some higher ethical principle to legitimize it. He thought intense national loyalty could make the state self-justifying. The source hints that maybe the real job of his virtuous prince was actually to create that state by manipulating those very nationalistic feelings or illusions.
But that only works if you assume there is no higher standard to judge the state by.
Exactly. An assumption Machiavelli makes, but never really defends philosophically. So, the source argues he becomes an uncritical cheerleader for the nation-state. That passionate appeal to Lorenzo at the end of The Prince to unite Italy. The source sees that as him falling prey to his own advice, getting caught up in the greatest illusion of the modern age, nationalism, forgetting his own cool, empirical stance.
Were there practical flaws in his vision too?
Yes. The source points out his actual political formula was incomplete. He had a very imperfect notion of what it really takes to build and run a complex modern state. The prince is particularly thin here, and even the discourses, while better, is seen as inadequate. He talks about needing administration, but sometimes seems to envision a united Italy as just a bigger Florence.
He didn't map out the bureaucracy, representation, rights.
No. The source notes he doesn't really tackle the new role of citizenship in a large state. Mechanisms for representation, limits on government power, individual rights, all the stuff that became central to political debate after him.
And what about religion? He saw its use, but missed something crucial.
He saw its use for building authority, yes, but his view of it as just another illusion to be managed blinded him, the source argues, to its power as a source of profound, real, and often violent conflict. He might treat religious beliefs as manipulable, but millions of people didn't. The century after him was torn apart by religious wars, proving him wrong on that. He didn't foresee the intensity of the coming church-state struggle sparked by the Reformation.
So all these critiques paint him as very much a figure of transition.
Exactly. They all point to him being midway between medieval and modern. Like the Renaissance itself, he's looking forward, seeing the future, but also still partly rooted in the past, with an incomplete grasp of what that future would fully look like.
The source wraps up by bringing in two final, very Machiavellian terms, virtue and fortuna.
Right. Virtue we've touched on. It's not moral virtue. It's the collection of qualities that let humans, especially leaders, impose their will on events. Boldness, skill, intelligence, courage, decisiveness, foresight, the ability to act effectively and shape things. Machiavelli admired this hugely. He saw the state as a human creation, a work of art made possible by virtue.
And fortuna is the counterforce.
Exactly. Fortuna is fortune, fate, luck, chance, all the stuff that happens that's outside human control, unpredictable. No matter how much virtue you have, fortuna can always intervene.
So the big underlying theme in his work is this constant struggle between human skill, virtue, and sheer unpredictable luck or fate.
Fortuna. That's the dynamic. To what degree can intelligent planning and bold action actually control the randomness of events?
And his answer was,
Control is always limited, always imperfect. The world, politics, history, they're never fully predictable or controllable. There's always fortuna. In this, he actually echoes some classical thinkers with a more cyclical view of history. Things rise and fall, chaos can be managed but never totally eliminated.
and the source points to the thinker who tried to eliminate fortuna.
Thomas Hobbes, who, the source says, completes what Machiavelli began. Hobbes also throws out the classical medieval tradition, but he brings the power of modern science, something Machiavelli didn't have, to the table.
And Hobbes had a grander ambition.
Much grander. Hobbes wanted to use science and the power of the absolute state to basically abolish fortuna from politics altogether, to bring human affairs fully under rational human control for the first time. But, as the source says, Hobbes is a whole other deep dive.
Wow. Okay, so just to pull this all together for this deep dive on Machiavelli, we've gone from the chaotic Renaissance world that forged his realism through the tough rules of power in The Prince and hopefully cleared up some myths to his surprising preference for authority and a stable republic in the discourses. And critically, we've seen his radical break from tradition, his focus on reality over ideals, on opulence over substance, and his fundamentally amoral approach to politics as its own sphere.
And, looking at Machiavelli like this, it isn't just history. That relentless focus on power, on self-interest, that tension between our ideals and the messy way things actually work, it feels incredibly relevant today, doesn't it? You see it in global politics, in business, maybe even in personal relationships sometimes. We're always wrestling with that gap. He identified how we live versus how we ought to live.
Absolutely. And here's a final thought to chew on, something for you to consider. If Machiavelli is right, or even partly right, that appearances are so incredibly powerful in politics that the illusion of morality or order can sometimes be more effective than the real thing. How should that change how we, as citizens, consume news, choose leaders, judge events? What responsibility does that put on us to try and see past the appearances he talked about? Something to think about.
Definitely gives you a lens to look at today's world, that's for sure.
Until next time, keep digging deeper.